Welcome back to the channel. Before we begin today, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stood at the edge of a moment in history and felt the weight of everything that was almost possible? Not a failure exactly, not a triumph either, but something suspended between the two, like a breath held for too long, like a dream that almost became real and then, quietly, vanished. That is the feeling this story leaves you with, and I promise you by the time we reach the end of it together, you will understand exactly what I mean. Today we are going to travel back to a very specific place and a very specific time. The place is the Solent, the stretch of water that separates the south coast of England from the Isle of Wight. The time is the early 1950s, when the world was still rebuilding itself. I still shaking off the dust of a devastating war, and still daring, with enormous ambition, to imagine what the future might look like. And somewhere in that future, a group of British engineers and designers had decided, with complete seriousness, that the age of the great flying boats had not ended, that it had only just begun. The aircraft they created was called the Saunders-Roe Princess, and I want you to picture it for a moment before we say another word. 10 propellers, a fuselage wider than a London bus, a double-deck interior with room for over 100 passengers, sleeping berths, a dining saloon that would not have embarrassed a fine hotel, a pressurized cabin that floated above the weather, above the noise, above the turbulence that plagued lesser aircraft, and underneath it all, a hull that could land on the open sea, that needed no runway, no concrete, no vast infrastructure of airports and terminals. Just water. Just the ancient, elemental surface of the ocean, there to receive it like a hand extended in welcome. Can you imagine boarding an aircraft like that and finding yourself not in a cramped fuselage smelling of fuel and anxiety, but in a space that felt, genuinely and deliberately, like the finest lounge on the finest ocean liner of its day? Because that is what the Princess was designed to offer, and the most extraordinary thing is that it was real. It was built. 3 of them were built, and yet almost no one has heard of it today. That is the story we are going to tell, and it is one of the most bittersweet, most beautiful, most quietly devastating stories in the entire history of aviation. Let us begin at the beginning, or rather, let us begin at the end of something, because the Saunders-Roe Princess cannot be understood without understanding what came before it, and what the world believed in the years immediately after the Second World War about the future of long-distance travel. For roughly 2 decades before the Princess took shape on the drawing boards of the Saunders-Roe Company at Cowes on the Isle of Wight, the great flying boats had ruled the long-distance routes of the world. Not the short hops between European capitals, not the domestic services between cities connected by road and rail, but the grand, heroic, oceanic routes that joined continents and empires. The routes across the North Atlantic, the routes from Britain to Africa, to India, to Australia, to the Far East. The routes that, before the flying boat, had required weeks aboard a ship, are subject to the mercy of the sea and the limitations of the human body. The flying boats changed all of that. The Imperial Airways Empire-class boats, the Pan American Clippers, the short Sunderlands converted for civilian life, these were not merely aircraft. They were a new category of experience. They were, in the most literal and complete sense, palaces of the air. And the men and women who flew in them were not passengers in any ordinary sense. They were travelers, in the old aristocratic meaning of the word. People for whom the journey itself was part of the purpose. People who dressed for dinner at altitude. People who expected and received a level of service and surroundings that most of their fellow citizens would never encounter in their entire lives. The short Empire-class boats, which Imperial Airways operated through the late 1930s, seated around 24 passengers in a space that included a separate smoking saloon, a promenade deck, and a dining area where full meals were served on white linen with proper silverware. The Pan American Clippers, those magnificent Boeing 314s that crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific, went even further. Sleeping berths that converted from day seats, a formal dining room where passengers ate by candlelight, a bridal suite on some configurations, a lounge where you could stand and look out of large rectangular windows at the ocean thousands of feet below, the scale of it barely comprehensible from that altitude, the light on the water changing hour by hour as the great machine moved west into the afternoon or east into the rising sun. This is where one begins to understand what the Saunders-Roe Princess was inheriting. It was not just inheriting a technology. It was inheriting a philosophy, a belief deeply held and carefully argued that the act of traveling across the world at high altitude should be an experience worthy of the distance and the occasion, that there was no virtue in discomfort, that the future of air travel did not have to mean more passengers in less space with less dignity. It could mean the opposite. It could mean the apotheosis of everything the great flying boats had promised, realized finally, definitively, in an aircraft of unprecedented scale and sophistication. Saunders-Roe, the company behind the Princess, had deep roots in flying boat construction. They had been building aircraft for the better part of 3 decades, and their facility at Cowes was one of the most experienced flying boat design teams in the world. When, in the late 1940s, they began serious work on what would become the Princess, they brought to it not only engineering expertise, but a genuine sense of occasion. They knew what they were attempting. They knew it was ambitious beyond anything that had been done before, and they believed, with the kind of confidence that belongs only to people who do not yet know how the story ends, that they were going to succeed. The specification that drove the design was issued by the British Overseas Airways Corporation, BOAC, the great state airline that had emerged from the wartime reorganization of British civil aviation. BOAC wanted an aircraft that could operate the transatlantic route between Britain and the United States, or carrying a large number of passengers in great comfort, using the existing network of marine terminals and seaplane bases that had been developed during the golden age of the flying boats. Southampton in England, Baltimore in America. No need for vast concrete runways. No need for the enormous expense of building new airports from scratch. Just the sea, which was already there, which had always been there, which cost nothing and required no construction. This was, on the surface, an entirely reasonable proposition, and the aircraft that Saunders-Roe designed to meet it was, in purely engineering terms, one of the most extraordinary machines ever built in Britain or anywhere else. The Princess was enormous. Let us spend a moment truly appreciating how enormous it was, because the numbers alone do not quite convey it. The wingspan was just over 148 feet. The length of the fuselage was 148 feet as well, almost exactly square in its proportions when viewed from the side, giving it a solidity, a massiveness, that photographs struggle to communicate. The total weight at takeoff was around 325,000 pounds, more than 147 tons, making it one of the heaviest aircraft ever built at that point in history. And it was propelled by 10 engines, arranged in an extraordinary configuration along those vast wings. 6 of them paired in coupled installations that drove contra-rotating propellers, the 2 blades spinning in opposite directions on the same axis, a solution to the engineering challenge of packing that much power into that much wing. The remaining 4 drove single propellers in a more conventional arrangement. The result was a sound unlike anything else in aviation. Not the roar of a jet, which the world would only just be beginning to encounter in those years. A deep, complex, layered chord of propeller-driven power felt as much through the hull as heard through the air. But the engines, magnificent as they were in their complexity, are not the point. The point is what that power made possible inside the fuselage. The point is the experience of being on board. Picture yourself arriving at the marine terminal at Southampton in let us say 1953. A morning in early summer, the Solent is grey-green and flat, the light diffuse and soft, the air carrying that particular mix of salt and diesel and something harder to name that belongs only to working waterfronts. And you have arrived with your luggage, which has been taken from you at check-in and which you will not see again until you disembark on the other side of the Atlantic. You are wearing, because it is 1953, and this is an intercontinental flight on a prestige aircraft, your best traveling clothes. The women around you are in their finest wool coats and silk scarves. The men are in dark suits, some with hats. There is an air of occasion, a seriousness of purpose, that belongs to an era when flying across the ocean was still understood to be a remarkable thing, a thing worth marking. You board via a gangway that connects the terminal to the forward hatch of the aircraft, stepping across that brief gap between the world of land and the world of water and air, the hull riding easily at its mooring. It's the enormous machine utterly still in the calm water. And then you are inside. The first thing you notice is the space, not just the horizontal space, the width of the cabin, which is at its widest about 11.5 feet, generous by any standard, but not in itself staggering. No, what strikes you is the vertical space. The Princess has a double-deck interior, and the main lower deck, where the passenger accommodation is arranged, has a ceiling high enough to stand in without any sense of confinement, high enough for a tall man to walk upright and feel entirely at ease. This is not a tube. It is not a pressurized tin can. It is a room. A series of rooms, in fact, because the interior of the Princess is divided into 7 separate compartments on the main deck, each with its own character, its own purpose, and its own arrangement of seating or sleeping or dining. The seating in the day configuration is arranged in pairs on either side of a central aisle, but these are not the seats you know from any aircraft of today. They are armchairs, genuinely wide and deeply upholstered, the kind of chair that suggests you are meant to settle into it for a long time and be comfortable. The fabric is a muted, refined pattern, the colors chosen to suggest restfulness and quality. The windows beside each seat are large and well-positioned, and through them, once you are airborne, you will have uninterrupted views of the sky and the sea below, the horizon remarkably steady because at the altitudes and speeds the Princess was designed to operate, the ride is smooth in a way that smaller aircraft can never quite achieve. Mass, at altitude, confers a kind of serenity. Can you imagine stepping from that armchair and actually walking, through a connecting door into a separate compartment dedicated entirely to dining? Because that is what was planned. The dining saloon on the Princess was not a galley trolley brought to your seat. It was not a plastic tray balanced on a fold-down table barely wide enough for a glass of water. It was a proper dining room, tables set with linen and glassware, a menu that reflected the ambitions of the aircraft, the same ambitions you would find aboard the finest ships on the same transatlantic route. Smoked salmon, roasted meats, British cheeses, wines chosen with care, and all of it served by stewards who understood that the meal was not an interruption of the journey, but a central part of it. One of the great pleasures of crossing an ocean was that you had the time, the genuine luxury of time, to sit down and eat well, to take 2 hours over a lunch that you might otherwise have rushed through in 20 minutes. The most surprising thing is that this level of service was not a fantasy or a marketing promise. It was the lived reality of the great flying boat era, and the Princess was designed to be the supreme expression of it. The companies that operated the pre-war boats had already demonstrated that passengers were willing to pay, and pay handsomely, for exactly this kind of experience. BOAC knew it. Saunders-Roe knew it. The entire philosophy of the Princess rested on the conviction that there was a substantial market, not a mass market, but a reliable and wealthy market, for transatlantic travel conducted at this level. And then there were the sleeping arrangements. The Princess, in its overnight configuration, was designed to convert its passenger seating into sleeping berths, proper horizontal sleeping berths with privacy and bedding, so that the crossing of the Atlantic, which at the Princess's intended cruising speed of roughly 360 miles per hour would take somewhere in the region of 16 to 18 hours, could be accomplished in genuine rest. Not the shallow, neck-cramping doze of a modern long-haul seat, not the expensive capsule-like flatbeds of contemporary business class, but the deep, restorative sleep of someone lying flat in a proper bed, in a quiet, well-pressurized, smoothly riding aircraft, waking to find themselves somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, or already beginning the long and gentle descent toward the American coast. Think about that for a moment. You board in Southampton in the evening, you have dinner, you have a brandy, perhaps, or a whiskey. The steward helps you convert your berth, draws the curtain, wishes you good night. And you sleep, genuinely sleep, crossing the ocean in the dark, and wake to breakfast being served as the American coast slides into view below. That is not a description of something futuristic. That is a description of what the Princess was designed to offer, and what the great flying boats had already been offering in more modest form for 15 years before the Princess ever flew. The upper deck of the aircraft, accessible by a companionway from the lower deck, was in the initial design primarily structural and operational, housing crew facilities and some of the aircraft's systems. But even here, the scale of the machine left room for spaces that a lesser aircraft would never have possessed. There was talk, in the design discussions, of making parts of the upper deck accessible to passengers in a more informal capacity, a place to stand and look out from a higher vantage point, a promenade of sorts above the main cabin. Whether this was ever fully realized in a production aircraft we will never know, because the Princess, in the event, never entered commercial service. But the aspiration itself tells you everything about the spirit in which this aircraft was conceived. Let us step back now and ask a question that the history books sometimes fail to ask clearly enough. Why did the Princess fail? Because it did fail, and quite catastrophically, and in the commercial sense. 3 aircraft were completed. 1 flew extensively in trials. The other 2 were completed to a lesser standard, and never flew at all. All 3 were eventually cocooned, wrapped in a kind of industrial chrysalis of sprayed rubber compound to protect them from the elements, and stored. And then, in the early 1960s, they were broken up for scrap, their aluminum alloy hull sections and wing panels reduced to raw material, the extraordinary care and craft of their construction yielding nothing more than the value of the metal itself. Why? How does something like that happen to something like this? The answer is not simple, and it is important to resist the temptation to reduce it to a single cause. It's because the story of the Princess is really the story of several different kinds of failure converging at the same moment in history, and the resulting wreckage is more instructive and more poignant than any single explanation can capture. The first and most obvious cause was the jet engine. In 1952, the year the Princess made her first flight, the de Havilland Comet entered commercial service. It was the world's first jet airliner. And whatever its early technical problems, which were severe and led to a grounding and a fundamental redesign, the Comet announced to the world with absolute clarity that the future of long-distance air travel was jet-propelled, not propeller-driven. And jet-propelled meant, above all, faster. The Comet cruised at roughly 500 miles per hour, compared to the Princess's intended 360. The Princess's crossing of the Atlantic in 16 to 18 hours suddenly looked very long, very slow, in a world where the same journey might soon be accomplished in 7 or 8 hours. The entire proposition of the overnight sleeping berth, the leisurely dinner, the unhurried crossing, was predicated on the journey taking long enough to justify it. Shorten the journey enough, and the proposition collapses. But this explanation, while true, is incomplete, because the Comet did not immediately replace everything. The Douglas DC-6 and the Lockheed Constellation, both piston-engined, both roughly contemporary with the Princess, continued to operate the transatlantic routes profitably for years after the Comet's introduction. Speed alone was not the decisive factor. The decisive factor was economics, and here the Princess faced problems that were entirely its own. The economics of the Princess were, to put it gently, formidable. The aircraft was enormously expensive to build. It was expensive to operate. Its engines, the Bristol Proteus turboprops that powered it, were themselves still under development during the Princess's construction, causing delays and modifications that drove costs upward relentlessly. The marine infrastructure it required, the terminals, the tugs, the mooring equipment, the maintenance facilities capable of handling an aircraft of its scale, all of it represented a capital investment that BOAC, already stretched by the post-war reorganization of British aviation and already committed to the jet-powered future represented by the Comet and its successors, was increasingly reluctant to make. And there was a deeper problem still, one that cuts to the heart of what the Princess represented, and why it could never quite find its moment. The flying boat was a technology born of a specific historical situation, the absence of adequate land airports across the routes that mattered most. In the 1930s, when the Empire boats and the clippers defined what long-distance air travel meant, there were simply no runways long enough or strong enough to accommodate large land planes on most of the routes they flew. The sea was the runway. It was universal, free, and infinitely extensible. A flying boat could land at any calm body of water in the world, which meant it could serve routes and destinations that were simply inaccessible to any land plane. But the Second World War had changed all of that. The war had required the construction of airfields, vast concrete runways capable of handling the largest military aircraft all over the world. The Pacific Islands, the African coast, the Indian subcontinent, the Caribbean, the coasts of North and South America. By the time the war ended, the infrastructure problem that had made the flying boat indispensable had largely been solved, not by civilian investment, but by the enormous military necessity of the war itself. Land planes could now reach almost everywhere. And land planes, it turned out, were cheaper to build, cheaper to maintain, easier to operate, and faster to turn around between flights. The terminal at a land airport could handle hundreds of passengers efficiently. The marine terminal, with its tugs and tenders and the slow process of boarding from a floating hull, was inherently slower, more labor-intensive, more dependent on weather conditions in the harbor. The Princess was, in this sense, an answer to a question that history had already resolved. And there is something genuinely tragic in that, because the question it was answering was, in aesthetic and experiential terms, a much better question than the one the jet age was busy answering instead. What kind of experience should crossing an ocean offer? That is the question the Princess was built to answer. The jet age answered a different question entirely. How quickly can we move the maximum number of people from one place to another? Both are legitimate questions, but one of them belongs to an era of travel as experience, and the other belongs to an era of travel as logistics. And we know, looking back from where we stand today, which era won. There was also the matter of the British government, and here the story acquires the particular flavor of institutional failure that characterizes so many of the great what-ifs of post-war British aviation. The government had backed the Princess project. The Ministry of Supply had contracted Saunders-Roe to build 10 aircraft, though this was later reduced and then reduced again, and the process of backing away from the commitment was slow, equivocal, and deeply damaging to the project's momentum and economics. BOAC, for its part, had already decided by the early 1950s that its future lay with land planes and jets, not flying boats. But it did not say so clearly, immediately, and decisively. Instead, the airline maintained a kind of cautious official interest in the Princess, long after the internal conviction had been lost, keeping the project alive in a kind of bureaucratic limbo that satisfied no one and cost everyone time and money. By 1952, when the first Princess, registered GALUN, made her maiden flight from the Solent with Chief Test Pilot Jeffrey Tyson at the controls, the aircraft that emerged was magnificent in almost every measurable sense. She handled well. She flew smoothly. The pressurization worked. The engines performed. The testers came back from early flights with expressions of genuine admiration for what the aircraft could do. Tyson himself was unambiguous in his enthusiasm. This was a great aircraft. In the purely technical sense, Saunders-Roe had achieved something remarkable. Oh, and yet by the time GALUN had accumulated sufficient test hours to be considered ready for certification, there was no operator willing to commit to flying her commercially. BOAC had walked away. American operators, who might have been interested in a transatlantic flying boat service, had their own aircraft programs and their own institutional preferences. The smaller operators who expressed occasional interest never had the financial resources to commit. The Princess stood on the Solent, magnificent and purposeless, like a great ship built for a route that had been closed. In 1954, the decision was made to cocoon all 3 completed aircraft. The word cocoon is almost unbearably apt here, because it implies the possibility of emergence, of resurrection, and of some future moment when the protective covering will be removed and the thing inside will fly again. A succession of operators over the following decade considered purchasing or leasing the aircraft. There were discussions with American operators. There were suggestions of using the aircraft on routes to Africa or to Australia, where the flying boat's independence from land infrastructure might still have offered an advantage. None of these came to anything. The cocoons stayed on. And then, in 1967, the decision was made to scrap them, all 3. The work was done quickly and thoroughly. By the time it was finished, there was nothing left to see. No museum piece, no preserved example, no hull section in a hangar somewhere that you could visit on a Sunday afternoon and run your hand along the riveted skin and think, this is it. This is what it was. This is what it might have been. There is nothing. The Princess exists today only in photographs, in film footage, in the memories of those who saw her fly, most of whom are no longer with us, and in the imagination of anyone who hears this story and feels, as I believe you probably feel right now, the particular sadness of something extraordinary that was never allowed to reach its full expression. Let me tell you a little more about that first flight, because it deserves to be described properly, and because the people who witnessed it never quite forgot what it felt like to see this enormous machine lift itself from the water for the first time. The date was August the 22nd, 1952. The Solent was calm, the summer morning clear enough to see the Isle of Wight in full detail across the water. What a small crowd had gathered at Cowes, the staff of Saunders-Roe, local residents who had watched this extraordinary shape being assembled in the hangars over the preceding years, a few press photographers who understood, even then, that they were witnessing something that might not come again. Jeffrey Tyson taxied GALUN out into open water, turned her into the light southerly wind, and opened the throttles. What happened next is described by those who were there in terms that belong more to poetry than to technical reporting. The sound was the first thing. That complex, layered chord of 10 engines at full power, building from a deep resonance to a sustained, overwhelming roar that seemed to fill the entire harbor. Then the spray. As the hull accelerated through the water, the spray climbed the sides of the fuselage. A white and brilliant in the morning light, the sea seeming reluctant to release this enormous thing that was insisting on leaving it behind. And then the hull lifted, cleanly, decisively, the spray falling away all at once, and the Princess was airborne, climbing steadily, silently from the perspective of anyone watching from the shore. the sound of those 10 engines already beginning to diminish with distance as she turned and headed out over the channel. She flew for 35 minutes on that first flight. When she landed back on the Solent, the crowd on the shore applauded. Some of them, by later accounts, had tears in their eyes, not because of sentimentality, but because of recognition, because they had just seen, for 35 minutes in the summer sky above the Isle of Wight, proof that it was possible, that the thing they had spent years designing and building and arguing for and defending in committee rooms in London and Southampton was real, that it flew, that it was everything they had hoped. It flew. And it was, in that moment, enough. But let us return to the passenger experience, because that is ultimately what this channel is about, and because the passenger experience the Princess promised is one of the richest and most fully imagined in the history of commercial aviation, even if it was never fully realized in the commercial sense. Imagine the crossing of the North Atlantic in the Princess at the height of its intended operation, sometime in the mid-1950s, in the alternative history where BOAC committed to the aircraft and the service began as planned. You are a businessman, perhaps, or a diplomat, or an academic traveling to a conference in New York. You might be a couple traveling for pleasure, anniversary or honeymoon, or simply the expedition of a lifetime. You are, in any case, someone for whom this journey is an occasion, someone who has chosen to travel on the Princess rather than on the faster, cheaper, less remarkable land-plane alternatives, because you understand that the journey is not merely the getting there, but the experience itself. Southampton is where it begins. The flying boat terminal is a world apart from the land airport. There is none of the functional grimness that airports were already beginning to acquire by the early 1950s, the endless concrete corridors, the institutional lighting, the sense of being processed rather than served. The marine terminal has the atmosphere of an exclusive hotel or a private club. The lounge is well furnished. The service is attentive. Your luggage has been weighed and labelled and taken away to be loaded into the hold of the aircraft, which you can see through the terminal windows, riding at its mooring in the grey-green water of the Solent, immense and somehow graceful, the morning light catching the aluminum skin and turning it to silver. Departure is not announced over a public address system with the impersonal urgency of a modern airport. It is communicated, quietly and personally, by a member of the ground staff who comes to you individually and lets you know that the aircraft is ready and that they would be happy to escort you to the boarding area. This is not theatre. It is the natural consequence of a service that was designed, from the beginning, around the passenger rather than the schedule. The tender that takes you from the terminal to the aircraft is small and quiet, the crossing of the harbour lasting only a few minutes. You board via a door in the forward hull, ducking slightly as you step in from the outdoor air, and then you are inside. And the first thing you experience, even before you look around properly, is the smell. Not the synthetic, recycled smell of a pressurized modern cabin. Something different. Leather and fabric and something faintly metallic and clean. The smell of a well-made, well-maintained machine. The smell of care and quality. Your seat is waiting. Your name in a small card holder on the armrest. The seat itself is, as I described earlier, genuinely comfortable, and wide and deep and upholstered in fabric that suggests someone thought about it, that someone chose it rather than simply specifying the cheapest option. The window beside you is large, and through it you can see the harbour, the terminal, the green hills of the Isle of Wight beyond. The light changes as the sun moves. You are comfortable, you are at ease, you are already, before the engines have even started, in a world apart. When the engines do start, beginning one by one, and then building to that extraordinary full chord, the sensation is unlike anything a land plane offers. There is no runway roll, no compression of the body into the seat as the aircraft accelerates down concrete. Instead, the hull is alive in the water, moving with a suppleness and responsiveness that belongs to the marine world. And then the throttles are opened, and the acceleration is there, powerful and insistent, and the spray climbs the windows until everything outside is white, and then the spray falls away and the windows clear and you are airborne, and below you the harbour is already shrinking, already becoming a painting, the boats and terminals and jetties reduced to toys, the water catching the light in 1,000 simultaneous points, and then the Isle of Wight slides past beneath you, and the channel opens up ahead, and the Princess is climbing steadily and serenely toward her cruising altitude. At cruising altitude, the cabin is quiet. Not silent, because nothing with 10 propeller engines is ever truly silent, but quiet enough for conversation at a normal register. Quiet enough to read without effort. Quiet enough that when the steward comes to take your order for lunch, you can hear his voice clearly and respond without raising yours. Lunch. Let us spend a moment with lunch on the Princess, because it matters, and because the contrast with what air travel would become makes it almost surreal to contemplate. The menu is printed on a card, the airline's livery at the top, the offerings listed in a careful hand. You might begin with a soup, a clear consommé perhaps, or a creamed soup of vegetables from the season. Then a fish course, sole or salmon, cooked properly and served with appropriate accompaniment. Then a main course of meat, roasted or braised, served with vegetables and potatoes, accompanied by a wine poured from a proper bottle into a proper glass. Then cheese and biscuits. It's because this is Britain in the 1950s, and cheese and biscuits are an entirely serious proposition. Then coffee, and with the coffee, perhaps a small glass of something, a port, a brandy, the choice yours. And all of it served on a properly laid table, on linen that has been pressed, with cutlery that has weight and presence, by stewards who are not harried, who are not managing 150 passengers with 4 trolleys and 12 minutes per row, but who have time, actual time, to do this properly, to do it well, to treat it as the serious activity it is. A meal like that on an aircraft in 1953. Can you imagine it? Most people today cannot, because nothing in their experience of air travel gives them any framework for understanding it. The meal service on a modern long-haul flight is designed, above all, for efficiency. It has to be, given the numbers involved, given the economics, given the entirely different set of priorities that govern commercial aviation today. There is nothing wrong with it, exactly. But it is a different thing entirely. A different thing in kind, not just in degree. After lunch, the afternoon stretches ahead of you. The Princess is 3 or 4 hours out over the Atlantic now, the coast of England long since invisible behind you, the coast of America still 8 or 9 hours ahead. Below, the ocean is doing what the ocean does, sometimes flat and dark and featureless, sometimes broken with white caps when the wind is up, sometimes catching the afternoon sun in long rolling lines of light that move slowly westward and then vanish. From this altitude, from this height of comfort and serenity, the Atlantic is not threatening. And it is beautiful. It is one of the great natural spectacles of the world, and you are seeing it from a position of privilege and ease that very few human beings, in the entire history of human beings, have ever had the opportunity to experience. You might read. You might sleep. You might simply look out of the window for a while, which is itself a pleasure, because the view from a large, well-positioned window at high altitude is one of the most consistently satisfying things that aviation offers, and it is a pleasure that requires nothing from you except the willingness to pay attention. You might walk because the Princess is large enough to walk in, to move between compartments, to stand in the aisle and stretch and look around at the other passengers and feel, in the best possible way, the social character of this shared experience, of this community of people crossing an ocean together. As the afternoon turns toward evening, the light outside the windows shifts from the clear blue of mid-altitude afternoon to something warmer and more complex, the sun descending toward the western horizon, the sky ahead of you, the direction of travel, deepening gradually through a range of colors that no window in a house or a car or a train ever quite frames in the same way. You are flying into the evening, flying into the setting sun, and the princess, with her smooth, stable ride and her large windows, gives you a view of it that is extraordinary. Dinner is an even more considered affair than lunch. By the time the stewards begin to lay the tables for the evening meal, the formality has increased slightly, as it always does in the evening. The dress is, if anything, slightly more deliberate. There is a sense of occasion in the cabin that has built naturally through the day, the shared experience of crossing an ocean creating a kind of fellowship among the passengers that you rarely find in airports or on shorter flights. You eat well. You talk, if you are in the mood for it, to your companions or to the pleasant strangers at the neighboring table. You drink wine, and afterwards something warming, and you feel, in the most fundamental and satisfying way, that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing, and that the world, at this specific moment, is a very fine place. Later, much later, when the windows show nothing but darkness and stars, and the cabin lights have been dimmed for the night, your steward helps you with the sleeping arrangements. And in the full sleeping configuration, the seat converts to a berth. There are sheets and a blanket, a small pillow. The berth is yours, genuinely yours, a private horizontal space in which to lie flat and close your eyes, and let the steady, almost imperceptible vibration of the aircraft become, paradoxically, a comfort rather than a disturbance. The sound of the engines, which by now you have long since stopped actively hearing, is simply there, a constant and reassuring presence, the sound of the machine continuing to do its work while you rest. You sleep. Somewhere beneath you, the Atlantic continues its ancient business, indifferent to the small silver shape passing over it in the dark. The stars from the windows are extraordinary at altitude, cleaner and more numerous than any stars you see from the ground, and the familiar constellations sharp and brilliant and close. But you are asleep. You are crossing the ocean in your sleep. And then, in the early morning, there is light again, and the world below is no longer water but land, and the land is the east coast of North America, and you are almost there. The descent and landing on water is, by every account of those who experienced it on the earlier flying boats, one of the most memorable moments of the entire journey. The approach is long and gradual, the speed and altitude decreasing so smoothly that you barely perceive the change until you look out of the window and see the water very close, and then the hull touches, and the spray climbs, and there is a brief, vigorous shuddering as the resistance of the water asserts itself, and then the spray falls away, and you are a boat again, riding on the surface, turning slowly in toward the terminal, the engines reducing to a quiet burble, the whole vast machine content, for now, to be a vessel rather than an aircraft. You have crossed the Atlantic. You have slept, and eaten, and looked out at the ocean and the stars. You arrive rested rather than exhausted. You arrive having had an experience, not merely having survived a journey. You arrive as a traveler in the fullest and most honorable sense of that word. That is what the Princess was designed to offer. And it is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it represents a vision of what air travel could have been. A vision that wasn't naive or impractical or purely nostalgic, but was grounded in real knowledge of what passengers wanted and real experience of what was possible to deliver. The men and women who designed and planned the Princess were not fantasists. They were professionals who had spent years studying the market, understanding their customers, and building something that matched what those customers genuinely valued. And yet the world turned in a different direction, and the Princess went with it. There is one more thing I want to say about the Princess, something that does not always make it into the historical accounts, but that seems to me essential to understanding what was lost when those 3 aircraft were broken up in 1967. It is this: the Princess was the last serious attempt, by any manufacturer anywhere in the world, to build a great passenger flying boat. After her, there were no more. The short Shetland, which had preceded her in the queue for a transatlantic flying boat contract, was abandoned even earlier. The Martin Mars, the giant American military flying boats, were not civilian aircraft. The Hughes Hercules, the famous Spruce Goose, flew once and was never used again. There were small amphibians, utility aircraft designed for specialized roles in remote regions. But the great passenger flying boat, the ocean liner of the air, the magnificent floating hotel that took off from harbors and landed on lakes and rivers and connected the world by water, that tradition ended with the Princess. She was the last of her kind. The final, fullest expression of an idea that had been growing for 2 decades, and that, in her, reached its maximum ambition and its final breath simultaneously. When you look at photographs of the Princess on the Solent, and riding at her mooring with the Isle of Wight behind her and the pale English sky above, you are looking at the end of something. Not just the end of a particular aircraft program, not just the end of a company's ambition, or a government's commitment, or an airline's strategic vision, but the end of an entire way of thinking about what air travel was for and what it could be. The end of the idea that an aircraft could be, in the deepest sense, a place worth being in, a place worth choosing, not just as a means of getting somewhere, but as an experience in itself. We have not entirely lost that idea. The finest business-class products on the best long-haul routes today represent a serious attempt to give passengers an experience rather than merely a seat. The private aviation world offers, to those who can afford it, a version of the personalized, unhurried, space-conscious travel that the great flying boats pioneered. And among the people who think carefully about these things, among the historians and enthusiasts and connoisseurs of aviation's lost luxuries, there is a persistent and entirely understandable appetite for the kind of experience the Princess represented. Proof that it is not just nostalgia for its own sake, but something more fundamental, a recognition that the human desire for dignified, beautiful, considered travel is real and enduring, even if the commercial structures that might serve it keep changing shape. The Princess herself is gone. Every rivet, every frame, every inch of the carefully designed and carefully crafted interior, all of it reduced to scrap aluminum 50-odd years ago. There is no museum where you can go and stand inside her and try to imagine the dining saloon and the sleeping berths and the long, smooth view of the ocean from a wide window in a comfortable chair. She exists only as an idea now, only as a story, only as the image she creates in the mind of anyone who hears about her and feels, as they should feel, the deep and genuine regret of something extraordinary that was never quite given its chance. But perhaps that is, in the end, part of what makes her so remarkable. The machines that got to do everything they were built to do, the aircraft that flew their routes and carried their passengers and were eventually retired to museums or scraped without ceremony, those are history. But the Princess, the machine that was built to the very edge of what was possible, or that flew and proved itself and was then denied its purpose by circumstances beyond its control, the Princess is something more than history. She is a dream that was, for a few years on the Solent in the early 1950s, more real than dreams usually get to be. A dream that flew, a dream that ate and slept and looked out at the ocean from a great height, and was, for those brief hours, everything it had promised to be. And I find that, in the end, more moving than many things that succeeded. So let me ask you this. As we come to the end of our journey today, if you had been given the chance to board the Princess on a crossing of the Atlantic, To sit in one of those wide armchairs and eat a proper dinner and sleep in a real bed above the ocean. Which moment of that experience would you have found most extraordinary? The meal, taken at a proper table while the Atlantic moved beneath you, the night crossing, sleeping while the stars turned outside your window, the first sight of the American coast in the morning light after all those hours, or simply the moment of takeoff from the Solent, when the spray fell away and the Princess lifted from the water and became, for a few hours, the most extraordinary way to cross an ocean that the world had ever produced? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them, and this is exactly the kind of conversation I love to have with you. If this story moved you, or fascinated you, or made you see the history of aviation in a slightly different way, please share it with someone who would appreciate it. There are people in your life who love history, who love the idea of a lost and elegant world. Who would want to know that this thing existed? Share it with them. It costs nothing, and it means everything to this channel. And if you are not yet subscribed, please do subscribe and hit the bell, because we have many more stories like this one ahead of us. Stories of impossible aircraft and extraordinary journeys. Stories of elegance and ambition and the particular beauty of things that were created at the very edge of what was possible. Stories that deserve to be told and remembered and passed on. The princess is gone, but for the next person who hears her story, she flies again. Until next time, thank you for traveling with me.